Hello, today we're going to be looking at living conditions in Whitechapel. We're going to be discussing some of the key terms that you'll need to know and some techniques that you can use to answer the different types of questions. This would be a good point for you to pause the video, go and get yourself some pen and paper and write down these 5 key terms. You should also practice stop and jot so that anytime you hear a key term, write down in your own words what that key term means. That will help you revise for this particular section. The 5 key terms that you need to know are rookeries, lodging houses, census records, Charles Booth and the Peabody Estate. Let's start first of all with rookeries. This was a name given to the overcrowded slums that people were forced to live in due to the population increase that was taking place in and around London at the end of the 19th century. As you can see from the picture, these areas were very heavily populated or densely populated. This would mean that there would be very little social cohesion, which means there wasn't a great deal of community spirit. This would often lead to high rates of crime because simply people just didn't know each other. Even though these places had very poor living conditions, they would often have quite high rents. Therefore, anybody that could just about afford to live here didn't have much spare income, and again, this would often lead to more crime. For people that could not afford permanent accommodation, you would have to go and live in a lodging house. This is a temporary accommodation, which was even worse than the living conditions in some of the rookery houses. This cartoon clearly exaggerates the living conditions in these lodging houses, but it's not far off. There would be a very small back garden, if one at all, where you'd have an outdoor toilet and there would be no indoor plumbing. Some of these lodging houses were so dilapidated, that means that they were in such bad condition that they were condemned and had to be torn down, such as the one being spoken about in Source A from the Board of Works, which is a government organisation that reports back on the conditions of some of the houses. Thirdly, we have census records. These are government documents that are taken at the moment every 10 years, and they show the occupation and how many residents you have living on a particular street. This census record from number 3 Bucks Row shows just how poor some of the people were living in Whitechapel. In this house there were 2 adults, where only one of them had a job, and 8 children. Compare this to other streets where there are servants and footmen and people that had much better paid jobs. This demonstrates that the people in Whitechapel clearly were living in poverty. Moving on, key term number 4 is Charles Booth. Charles Booth was a social researcher who looked into the living conditions of people in Whitechapel and produced pamphlets and maps in order to demonstrate his findings. These types of maps are useful for a number of reasons. First of all, it gives us an idea of what types of people lived on particular streets. For example, if we look at the orange streets, these are upper middle class and they're quite wealthy, whereas the streets that have been coloured in black are lower class and described here by Booth as being vicious and semi-criminal. These maps are also quite useful when you're looking at the diversity of areas in Eastern London. For example, you can imagine that there would probably be quite a lot of conflict and tension between residents that were quite wealthy and residents that were quite poor, considering that they live so close to each other, but they are so far away economically and socially. And key term number 5 is the Peabody Estate. In 1875, the government ruled on the Artisans and Dwellings Act in order to try and clean up some of these rookery problems in London. These model dwellings, or ideal houses, were financed by George Peabody, hence the name Peabody Estate. It made sure that the house owners were responsible for keeping their properties in good order and therefore tried to combat this problem of poor housing conditions. They were also reasonably cheap in comparison to some of the other high quality houses in that particular area. This is just one of the many ways in which people try to clean up the problem of poverty in London. Question 1 is always a features question. This is just an opportunity for you to explain in a very brief amount of detail a particular aspect of Whitechapel. Question 2 will always be a utility question or a usefulness question. Here's the question we have on the screen. Study sources A and B. How useful are sources A and B into an inquiry about level of poverty in Whitechapel? Explain your answer using sources A and B and your own knowledge of the historical context. For these questions, we always do 4 things. You need to talk about the source and details from the source. You need to talk about the source's provenance, i.e. its nature, its purpose and its origin, and the context of the source, i.e. all knowledge that you have which matches the sources that you've been given. If you have a look at the table on the right hand side, we have done this for both sources, and now we're going to explain how you put this into action. Source A is useful for an inquiry into poverty in Whitechapel as it shows the conditions that poor people lived in. For example, in the source it says that many of the houses are dirty and dilapidated. That's a direct quote taken from the source. And that some of them were so bad that they should be condemned. The provenance of the source, that's its nature and origin, i.e. where it's come from, or its purpose, the reason why it was made, i.e. the actions that it wants to be taken as a result, is from the Board of Works, which is a government organisation whose purpose is to observe the sanitation of certain areas and produce a report, which is both objective and truthful. This is really good provenance because not only have you told the examiner where this source has come from, but you've told the examiner why this source was made. You've also then backed this up with a reason as to why this makes this particular source quite useful, i.e. those 2 words, objective and truthful. These are really good words to use about a source because it demonstrates that this source has nothing to hide and that it's trying to be as accurate as possible. This makes the source really useful. I also know that many of the areas of Whitechapel were equally unsanitary. Many poor people stayed in overcrowded lodging houses or rookeries where 3 people would take it in turns to share the same bed. This is a really good piece of old knowledge because we've used not 1, not 2, but 3 pieces of specific contextual knowledge. And just to make your answer really clear, we're going to link back to the inquiry. Given its content and provenance, source A is very useful for an inquiry into conditions of the poor in Whitechapel. These types of links back make it really easy for the examiner to show that you're consistently addressing the inquiry. On the other hand, source B is not as useful into an inquiry about poverty in the Whitechapel area. In the source, it says that 3 Bucks Row is home to 2 adults and 8 children, but only the father has a job as a labourer. What you need to make sure that you're doing in order to gain top marks is that you're explaining how one source is useful and how one source is not as useful. This is going to ensure that you get into the top band for this question. From this we can infer that this family have a low income, but that is not really stated in the source. We're only guessing that. The provenance of the source also lacks usefulness as the census was only taken every 10 years, which means this is only a snapshot of this family's financial means at the time, and the enumerators sometimes made mistakes when recording the data. This means we are not being given an accurate picture of poverty in Whitechapel. Words like snapshot and accuracy show the examiner that you understand some sources have lots of weaknesses and that you're using those weaknesses to explain that this source isn't particularly useful. Many families did live in overcrowded areas such as the one at number 3 Bucks Row, so much so that the Dwellings Act of 1875 gave developers the specific mission of improving conditions in poor areas. Even though this source matches my own knowledge, the source itself is not as reliable for source A for an inquiry into poverty due to its provenance. This is a really good comparison, and it also allows you to link back to the inquiry. As we looked at before, each source only gives us a tiny part of the story. Each source has also got strengths and weaknesses regarding its provenance. For example, this one here by Charles Booth. Its strengths is that it's got 80 researchers to question local residents. This means that the source is based on lots of quantitative and qualitative data. However, as with any source, there are also weaknesses or gaps in the story. For example, this one doesn't give you any context or any explanation as to why conditions are so bad, nor does it give us any particular explanation as to why all lower class people are seen as semi-criminal. If you're looking at potential inquiries that you could use this source for, you could have poverty, overcrowding, problems with policing, and opinions about crime in the East End. Study source C. How could you follow up source C for an inquiry into attitudes towards the poor? What you're essentially being asked to do here is to act like an historian. All sources only tell you a fraction of the story. Therefore, you need to add other sources in to tell you the complete story of what happened in the past. Here, you're being asked to follow up this source with other sources to complete that picture. This question is worth 4 marks, and you get 1 mark for each box that you fill in correctly. The detail in the source needs to be specific. The question you ask must be relevant to that detail. The source you use also has to be specific, and you need to try and work out what information the source that you provided would give you in order to answer your own question. So here's what we've gone with. The detail in source C that I would follow up is that in the source it says there are lower class, vicious and semi-criminal. The question I'd like to ask here is, how common was crime in the Whitechapel area? The reason why I'm asking this is because clearly George Booth seems to think that crime was quite common on these particular streets. Therefore, he would have classed these people as being semi-criminal. The source that I would use to follow up this question, i.e. if I asked this question, what sources could I use to answer it, is a memo from a constable in H Division. H Division were the police that patrolled around the Whitechapel area, therefore they should surely know how much crime took place on these particular streets. So there you have it, living in Whitechapel in 5 key terms: rookeries, lodging houses, census records, Charles Booth and Peabody Estate.